The groom's words were a knife through Catalina Vargas's heart. "You're good for nothing," he hissed, then turned and walked away, leaving her standing at the altar, frozen in shock. Before the world could catch its breath, the heavy church doors flew open, and in strode Antonio Tony Moretti. His presence was like an earthquake, shifting the ground beneath her feet. "The wedding isn't over," he said, his voice as cold as steel. "It just changes grooms." Katie's world, once set on a path of love, was now spiraling into a dangerous new game, one that would require more than just survival. Welcome back, my wonderful family and friends. If you're ready to dive into this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from. And trust me, you'll want to stick around, because tomorrow I've got another story that's just as powerful, and you won't want to miss it. Catalina, Katie Vargas, had always imagined her wedding day to be perfect, and this day, set in the Grand Cathedral of San Juan, Puerto Rico, felt like the embodiment of every dream she'd ever had. The towering Gothic arches, the intricate stained glass windows casting colorful patterns on the floor, and the aroma of fresh flowers mixed with the soft strains of the string quartet. Everything was just as it should be. Guests filled the pews, their faces filled with excitement, pride, and admiration. The church was alive with anticipation, and Katie's heart fluttered in time with the music. Her father, Diego Vargas, stood proudly beside her, a quiet smile on his face, his hand gently resting on her arm. He had always been her rock, and today he was the last vestige of stability she thought she could rely on. This was it, the moment that would change her life. Gabriel Rossi, her fiancé, stood across from her, looking dashing in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his dark hair combed to perfection. They had been planning this day for a year, and as far as Katie was concerned, it was everything she had hoped for. The excitement bubbled inside her like champagne, the future bright and wide open. Yet, as she caught Gabriel's eye for a fleeting moment, something about him didn't sit right. His jaw was clenched tight, and despite the cool air conditioning, a thin sheen of sweat traced down his temple. He refused to meet her gaze, instead staring ahead, his focus nowhere near her. She tried to shake the unease creeping over her. Maybe it was just nerves. Everyone gets nervous, she reminded herself. She had to push it out of her mind. Today wasn't about nerves, it was about love, commitment, and the future she was about to share with Gabriel. Katie had spent the last several months obsessing over every detail of this wedding. Her Vera Wang dress, a masterpiece of lace and satin, had taken 6 months to create. It fit her like a second skin, and when she looked at herself in the mirror, she could see nothing but perfection. The intricate beadwork on the bodice shimmered, catching the light as she walked down the aisle, and she had never felt more beautiful. Gabriel, too, looked perfect. His dark eyes, which had always been filled with warmth and affection, should have been reflecting the love they'd shared for the past 2 years. But something was off. His movements were stiff, his eyes distracted. His hand, which had once been so warm and reassuring in hers, was now cold. She couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in the pit of her stomach. Why wasn't he looking at her? "Focus, Katie," she told herself. "This is your day. Nothing else matters." But despite her best efforts to push the growing unease away, the tension in Gabriel's body was palpable. His refusal to meet her eyes, the tightness of his jaw, the way his breath seemed to catch every time the priest spoke. They all combined to create a cloud of discomfort that she couldn't ignore. Katie tried to convince herself it was just nerves. Everyone gets nervous before a big moment, especially a moment as life-altering as this. Gabriel had always been calm, collected, the kind of man who took life as it came, who could handle anything. Maybe that's why he's acting like this. Maybe he's too calm. He's just not showing it. As the priest's voice echoed through the cathedral, asking the final question of their vows, Katie thought she could finally relax. This was the moment they had been working toward. She'd marry Gabriel, and their lives would unfold just as they'd imagined. But when the priest turned to Gabriel and asked, "Do you, Gabriel Rossi, take Catalina Vargas to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Something shifted in the air. The question, so familiar, so expected, suddenly seemed like a trap. The words hung there, in the heavy silence of the cathedral. Gabriel's mouth opened, then it closed. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, but his eyes didn't meet hers. Katie's pulse quickened. Something's wrong. She saw him glance toward the door for just a split second. The faintest flicker of something she couldn't read crossing his face. And then, in a voice as cold as steel, Gabriel uttered the words she'd never thought she'd hear. "I can't do this." His voice was quiet, barely audible, but the words sliced through her heart like a dagger. Katie's breath caught in her throat. "What?" she whispered, the air suddenly thick, suffocating. "What are you—" "Worthless," he added, his voice a sharp whisper only she could hear, the coldness of it like ice over her skin. "Your family is bankrupt, your company is falling apart, and I'm not going down with you." Katie stood frozen, the weight of his words crashing over her like an avalanche. The gasps and murmurs of the guests around her began to swell, but she couldn't focus on them. Her world narrowed to nothing but Gabriel's retreating back as he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving her alone at the altar. The silence in the cathedral was deafening. 1,000 thoughts raced through Katie's mind, but none of them made sense. Her body felt like it was no longer hers, as if the weight of everything had left her a hollow shell. Her legs wouldn't move, her breath was shallow, and she could hear her heart pounding in her chest like a drumbeat. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, and the bouquet in her grasp seemed suddenly impossibly heavy. She looked up at the sea of faces staring at her, some filled with sympathy, some with shock, others with curiosity. Her mother's face was pale, her hand pressed to her mouth as if she couldn't believe what had just happened. Marco, her younger brother, looked as if he had seen a ghost. His face was drained of color, his eyes wide in disbelief. Her world was crumbling in front of her, and she could do nothing but stand there, frozen, as the whispers began to swirl around her. What went wrong? Did she make a mistake? What was she supposed to do now? Just as she thought she might collapse under the weight of the stairs and the whispers, the doors to the church exploded open with a sound that was more like a gunshot than anything else. The gasps and murmurs quickly shifted to startled cries as the force of the doors slamming against the stone walls reverberated through the church. A man stood in the doorway, his dark figure framed by the bright sunlight pouring in behind him. Antonio, Tony Moretti, a Mafia boss so powerful that just the mention of his name sent shivers down people's spines, strode into the church like he owned it. His presence was magnetic, impossible to ignore. He walked toward the altar with a calm but commanding air, his sharp gaze never leaving Katie. His tailored suit was immaculate, and his steps were slow, deliberate, as if he were in complete control of every moment. The entire room watched him with bated breath as he came to a stop beside her. In a voice that could cut through stone, Tony Moretti spoke. "This wedding won't end," he said, the words like a challenge. "It just changes grooms." His eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time all day, Katie felt like someone truly saw her. Before she could process what was happening, Tony extended his hand to her, the weight of it heavy and unyielding. "You marry me, or your family loses everything." Katie's heart stopped. The room was silent except for the soft click of Tony's shoes on the marble floor, his words hanging in the air like an executioner's sentence. The proposal was a threat, but it was also her only lifeline. She could fight back, but her family's future, her father's legacy, was hanging in the balance. If she said no, everything would be destroyed. Katie's hand shook as she reached out, her mind racing. The wedding she had dreamed of was gone. The man she thought she would marry had betrayed her in front of the people she loved. There was only one choice left. She took his hand, and in that moment, her life changed forever. The cold metal of Tony Moretti's hand wrapped around hers, and with it, everything she had known about herself and her world seemed to slip away. She felt dizzy, as if the cathedral floor had given way beneath her feet. The whispers of the crowd, once full of curiosity, now seemed like a distant echo, fading into nothing. All that remained was Tony, standing tall and unwavering in the face of it all, his dark eyes fixed on hers with an intensity she couldn't fully comprehend. He led her forward, his grip firm and unyielding, as if she was a piece of property he had just claimed. The doors of the church closed behind them with a heavy thud, sealing away everything she had just witnessed. In the grand, opulent reception hall awaiting them, the sounds of the world felt muffled, her heart still pounding in her chest, beating in time with the reverberating silence that followed her every step. The reception was everything she had never imagined. The room was decked out in gold and white, chandeliers glittering above, casting soft, mesmerizing light over the sea of well-dressed guests. The long tables were laden with crystal glassware and delicacies that seemed to sparkle as much as the smiles of those who were partaking. It was the epitome of high society, and yet nothing about it felt real. Katie's head spun as she tried to absorb her new reality, unable to process the whirlwind she had been thrown into. Tony's hand guided her to the center of the room, and the murmurs of the crowd silenced in an instant as they all turned to look at her. A hushed reverence filled the air, as though her arrival, or rather her forced participation, was the moment that had truly marked the beginning of something new. Tony led her to a chair at the head of the table, motioning for her to sit. It was then that she realized just how out of place she felt, like an object, put on display for the approval of those around her. She sat down mechanically, the weight of her wedding dress cascading around her, feeling more like a shroud than a symbol of joy. The world around her felt like it was moving in slow motion, as if she were watching it from a distance, unable to truly be part of it. How had she ended up here? She had always imagined this moment, the excitement, the beauty, the love, but instead, she had been thrust into a nightmare of betrayal and fear. Gabriel. Why, she thought, her mind spiraling back to the moment he walked away. She had trusted him, loved him. He had been the one person she had counted on, and now, in the blink of an eye, he had shattered everything. A flood of emotions rushed over her: confusion, betrayal, rage, and most of all, a bone-deep realization that her life was no longer her own. It was as if Tony had ripped her from the reality she had fought so hard to build and cast her into a world she didn't belong to. This marriage was not about love. It wasn't even about choice. It was about survival. She glanced at Tony sitting across from her. His face remained as stoic and impassive as it had been in the church. He showed no signs of emotion, no regret, no guilt, not even triumph. He was a man accustomed to power, to control, and in that moment, Katie realized he wasn't the one who had been defeated here. It was her. Tony leaned back in his chair, his presence commanding the room. He wasn't fazed by the spectacle or the aftermath of the public debacle that had just unfolded. His calm demeanor only served to unsettle her more, as if the chaos of the day had been nothing but an inconvenience to him, something to be dismissed with the simple flick of a wrist. "Catalina," he began, his voice smooth and unhurried, "this is how things are now. This marriage, it isn't about what you think, it's about what's necessary." She blinked, caught off guard by his casual tone. Her mind still buzzed with disbelief. "Necessary?" she repeated, her voice a little too shaky. "What do you mean, necessary?" His dark eyes flickered toward her, narrowing slightly. You and your family are in debt, he said flatly. My family is here to help, or rather, to collect. Katie's stomach twisted. She had heard vague mentions of financial troubles before, rumors, whispers of losses and bad deals, but nothing could have prepared her for the full impact of Tony's words. Her father's debts to the Morettis? She had always known that her family wasn't wealthy by any means, but she hadn't understood just how deep the financial hole they had dug was. Debt? She repeated, her voice rising with a mix of disbelief and anger. You expect me to believe that you… She cut herself off, the words sticking in her throat as how could she be expected to just accept this? Tony's gaze never wavered. Your father owed a significant sum to my family. This marriage is how we settle that debt. Your father couldn't pay, so now you will. By marrying me. Her heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know whether to scream or to curl up and disappear. This was not how her life was supposed to unfold. She hadn't signed up for this. Tony, however, seemed unbothered by her shock. You might be wondering what this world is all about, he said, his voice low and calm. Let me explain. The Moretti family runs a business, but it's not the kind of business you're familiar with. We deal in power, in loyalty, in control. My father built this empire, and now I'm running it. Everything we do is about securing our place, maintaining our position, and ensuring that we stay on top. He leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. And now, you're part of that. Katie's mind spun as Tony explained the intricacies of the Moretti Empire, how they controlled everything from shipping to security, from distribution to protection. It was a world of shadows, of secrets, of deals made behind closed doors, and now she was a pawn in it. She barely heard the rest of his speech. Her mind focused on the one thing she couldn't escape, her father's debt. It all made sense now. Why Gabriel had abandoned her, why Tony had stepped in. It was all business, nothing more. As the night wore on, the guests, many of whom were affiliated with the Morettis, watched her with a strange mix of curiosity and cold respect. She caught glimpses of their eyes on her, but none of them offered any sympathy. They were all too accustomed to power and wealth, too used to getting what they wanted without question. When Tony spoke to them, they nodded respectfully, as if he were the king and they were his subjects. She was the new queen in this twisted game, but she had no say in the rules. Catalina, Tony said, interrupting her thoughts, these are the people you'll be working with, and it's your job to prove that you belong. His voice was cold, as if he were talking about a business transaction. If you can't make it here, you won't last long. The words stung more than she could have expected. As he stood and moved to speak with another associate, she caught sight of the cold, calculating looks exchanged between the men around the table. They regarded her not as a person, but as an asset to be managed, controlled, and used. The realization hit her with full force. She wasn't a wife in the traditional sense. She was a tool in their world, a means to an end. The weight of the debt began to sink in. She had hoped her father's financial troubles would have some kind of solution, but this was no simple fix. This wasn't just about money. It was about power, control, and the very survival of her family. Katie looked at Tony, sitting across from her, his expression unreadable. She knew that this marriage was a form of repayment, but what kind of price had she just agreed to? What kind of life had she just signed up for? Her mind swirled with questions, and a wave of panic gripped her chest. Was it already too late to turn back? As the night wore on, Katie struggled to understand what had just happened. She had been thrust into a world she didn't understand, a world where power, violence, and betrayal ruled. She felt like a puppet, controlled by strings she couldn't see. But no matter how much she wanted to scream, to run away, she knew the truth. There was no escape, not anymore. Her survival, her family's survival depended on this. The price of this marriage wasn't just the ring on her finger, it was her soul. And now, as she sat there, trapped in the web of the Moretti family, she had to decide. Would she fight back, or would she succumb to the world she had been thrust into? It was too late to back out now. She had no choice but to play the game. Katie had barely stepped out of the extravagant limousine before she felt the weight of the situation hit her. The quiet stillness of the house she had grown up in seemed foreign, suffocating, as if it was already drowning in the consequences of her decisions. The quiet luxury of the home, the polished marble floors and opulent furniture, all seemed to mock her. How had it all come to this? Her father, Diego Vargas, was waiting for her in the living room, his expression a mix of guilt and resignation. His once proud posture seemed slightly slouched now, as if the weight of everything that had happened today had crushed him. He stood by the window, staring out into the distance, his hands clasped behind his back as though trying to regain some semblance of control. Katie's heart ached as she walked inside, the familiar scent of expensive leather and cedarwood filling the air, a smell that had once brought her comfort. But now, it was just a reminder of the trap she was in, a prison she had inherited, thanks to the man who had raised her. Katie. Diego's voice was barely a whisper, raw and full of regret. He turned to face her, but there was no warmth in his eyes. I know this wasn't what you planned. I never wanted this for you. I don't understand, Dad. Katie's voice cracked as she spoke, her emotions threatening to spill over. She had barely processed everything that had happened earlier that day, the spectacle of her wedding being hijacked by Tony Moretti. But now, facing her father, the reality was starting to settle in. Why did you do this? Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you warn me? Diego sighed deeply, his gaze dropping to the floor. I didn't have a choice, he said, the words heavy with years of hidden truths. I thought I could handle it. I thought I could fix everything before it came to this. But the Morettis... He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The weight of his failure hung between them like a thick fog. Katie shook her head, feeling a surge of frustration. She had always seen her father as a man of integrity, a self-made man who had built everything they had from the ground up. To hear him speak like this, admitting that he had failed her, broke something deep inside her. How could you let it get this bad? She whispered, her voice faltering. Diego walked over to the bar and poured himself a drink, the sound of the glass settling on the countertop like a final act of surrender. He took a sip, his eyes distant, lost in memories that Katie couldn't yet understand. It started small. I thought I could manage the debt, keep it under control. The Morettis, they don't just lend money, they take control. Every deal I made with them, every promise I thought I could get away with, it all tied us closer to them. Katie's pulse quickened. So this whole time, you were working with the Morettis? How much of this... She gestured to the house, to everything they had worked for. Was just a part of their plan? Diego ran a hand through his graying hair. He looked older, tired, as if the years had stripped him of everything that made him the man she had admired. I didn't want you to know. I kept you out of it, kept you away from the deals. But it wasn't just money, Katie. It was power. The Morettis control everything in this city, shipping, distribution, even security contracts. I thought I could play the game, but the game was rigged from the start, and when things started to fall apart, they came for what was theirs. Katie's mind reeled. She had known bits and pieces about her father's business dealings over the years, but she had never suspected this. She had never imagined that her family's future, their entire legacy, was tied to an empire of crime and corruption. She felt like she was suffocating, like the walls of the house were closing in on her. So, all of this, the wedding, Tony, was just part of the deal? The debt? Katie asked, her voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and anger. Diego nodded slowly, his face pale. Yes. I couldn't protect you from it anymore. I couldn't protect you from what I've done. This isn't just about you and me, Katie. It's about our survival. You are now part of the Moretti family. Whether you like it or not, you're in this." The finality of his words hit her like a punch to the stomach. The life she had known was gone. Everything she had worked for, everything she had dreamed of, was now tied to a man she barely knew, in a world she never wanted to be a part of. Katie collapsed into a chair, her hands clenched tightly in her lap as she fought back tears. The room around her seemed to spin, her thoughts tangled in a mess of anger, fear, and betrayal. She hadn't asked for any of this. Her life had just been hijacked by the greed and ambition of the man who had raised her. "Katie, listen," Diego's voice was softer now, but there was no comfort in it. "I did what I thought was best. I didn't want to drag you into this. But the Morettis, they don't give you options. They don't leave you with a choice." Katie wanted to scream. She wanted to throw everything in this room back at her father, to demand an answer that made sense, but there was nothing to say. She had no choice but to accept it, to accept that her life was now a transaction. Her marriage wasn't about love or even survival, it was about power, and she was now part of it. Her hands shook as she looked down at the diamond ring on her finger. The same ring that had been placed on her finger by Tony Moretti, the man who now owned her future. The weight of responsibility was crushing. It wasn't just about her anymore. The Vargas name, her family's reputation, their future, it was all now tied to the Moretti empire. And that empire didn't give a damn about anything other than loyalty, control, and profit. The sound of footsteps broke through her thoughts. Marco, her younger brother, once the carefree rebel of the family, now seemed like a shadow of his former self. He was dressed in a crisp shirt and slacks, but his eyes were bloodshot, his face hollow with a lack of sleep. He had always been reckless, but this time, the recklessness was different. It was dangerous. "Katie," he said, his voice hoarse, his hands fumbling with the collar of his shirt. I heard what happened. Are you okay? Are you okay?" she shot back, the anger bubbling to the surface. "What the hell, Marco? Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you have any idea what we are now part of?" He flinched at her words, but there was no denying the guilty look in his eyes. He knew exactly what kind of mess he had helped create. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way," Marco mumbled, his shoulders sagging. "But I've been trying to fix things, Katie. You don't know what it's like to live with the weight of it. The gambling, the debts, it's all spiraling." Katie's stomach twisted. Gambling. She knew about Marco's issues, but she hadn't realized just how bad things had gotten. And now, with their family already deep in debt to the Morettis, Marco's actions threatened to drag them all under. "You've been gambling with the Corderos, haven't you?" she asked, her voice trembling with the realization. The Corderos were the Morettis' rivals, the ones who were trying to take over everything the Vargas family had built. If Marco had been dealing with them, he was making everything worse. Marco looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "I didn't have a choice, Katie. The Corderos, they offered me money. They said they'd take care of things. But it got out of control, and now..." He trailed off, looking at her with a mixture of shame and desperation. "Now, I don't know how to fix it." Katie's chest tightened as she realized the full extent of the mess they were in. Marco's recklessness had pushed their family even further into the dangerous orbit of the Mafia, and she was now forced to clean up the wreckage. Every step she took to survive in this world of crime and control seemed to drag her deeper into the abyss. Her father's failed decisions, Marco's carelessness, and now her own marriage to Tony Moretti. Everything was intertwined in a web of lies, deceit, and violence. And as much as she wanted to turn away to escape, she knew there was no way out. The Morettis didn't let you walk away. She stood up, her body trembling with the weight of everything that had been thrust upon her. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was about fighting back, fighting for what was left of her family, even if it meant sacrificing everything else. Her first step into this world had been forced upon her, but now It was time to take control. Days had passed since Katie's world was turned upside down, and the weight of her new life pressed down on her with every passing moment. Despite the chaos of her forced marriage to Tony Moretti, one thing became abundantly clear. She had to learn how to play the game if she was to survive. The Mafia wasn't just a world of power, it was a world of information, secrets, and alliances. And in the vast network of lies and manipulation, Katie needed to know who she could trust and who would be the one to turn a knife in her back. It was in this quiet determination to take control of her fate that she found herself poring over every document related to her family's finances. For weeks, she had been buried in the labyrinth of numbers, trying to make sense of the mess her father had left behind. What began as a slow process of understanding quickly escalated into something darker. Katie knew something was off. The debt that had been passed on to her family wasn't just a simple business transaction. There were hidden figures, odd discrepancies in the books, and transactions to offshore accounts that didn't match up. She had always trusted her father, but now, as she dug deeper, she realized there were things he had kept from her, things that went beyond just the Moretti's grip on their business. In the dim light of her study, Katie sifted through another stack of financial reports, her eyes scanning the pages in search of answers. Her heart raced as she came across something that stood out: transactions to Cordero Enterprises. The Cordero family, rivals of the Morettis, enemies her father had been trying to avoid at all costs. Why was money being transferred to them? Her stomach churned as she quickly flipped through more documents, her mind connecting dots that shouldn't have been there. There it was, a pattern. Over the past 2 years, there had been multiple payments to Cordero Enterprises, all originating from a series of offshore accounts that Diego had been managing. At first, she thought it was a mistake, maybe some sort of mix-up. But as the evidence mounted, her suspicions grew. These weren't mistakes. Someone in her father's circle was deliberately feeding information to the Corderos, weakening their position while strengthening their enemies. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk as a cold realization settled in her gut. There was a mole in her father's inner circle, and Katie had to find out who before everything fell apart. Katie knew she couldn't rely on just the financial records to unearth the truth. She had to dig deeper. The Moretti family had taught her one thing: you couldn't trust anyone, not even those closest to you. It didn't take long for her to narrow down her list of suspects. There was only one person in her father's business circle who had the access, the motive, and the connections to make such dangerous decisions: Enrique Delgado. Enrique was her father's oldest business partner, the man who had been with the Vargas family since its early days. He was always present at family gatherings, a fixture in their lives, someone Katie had always respected. But that respect now felt hollow. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that Enrique's actions over the years had always been a little too smooth, his words a little too perfect, his motivations too secretive. Her suspicions took hold, and she began to go through Enrique's dealings. She spent nights going through the records from past deals, business lunches, and meetings. He had always been the one to handle the international connections, the ones with the shady companies, and those in the gray areas of the law. Katie dug through his personal communications, emails, messages, even his financial transactions. And then, it appeared like an open wound in the data, a direct connection between Enrique and the Corderos. A series of encrypted emails, references to meetings she hadn't known about, and coded language that confirmed her worst fear. Enrique had been working with the Corderos to undermine her family. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Her father's trusted right-hand man had been selling them out. He had been feeding the Corderos information, possibly even orchestrating the entire scheme that had now left her family trapped between the Morettis and their enemies. Her blood ran cold. What had seemed like a simple betrayal had now escalated into something much more dangerous. Enrique wasn't just a traitor. He was a calculated, cunning manipulator who had been playing both sides. And now, Katie knew she had to confront him, But the price of doing so could be devastating. She wasn't just fighting for her family's future anymore. She was fighting to protect everything her father had worked for. Katie didn't wait long. She knew that every second she spent hesitating made it more likely Enrique would cover his tracks or flee, disappearing into the dark corners of their business dealings. She arranged a meeting with him, under the guise of discussing some of the family's finances. It was a simple plan, but one that required precision. Katie knew Enrique too well. If she showed any signs of suspicion, he would slip away like a ghost. When the day came, she dressed carefully, keeping her emotions in check. There could be no sign of weakness now. She entered the meeting room, the long table between them creating a physical distance she couldn't ignore. Enrique, as usual, looked the part. Perfectly tailored suit, sharp eyes, and a demeanor that suggested nothing could touch him. "Enrique," Katie began, keeping her voice steady. "I've been going over the accounts. There are some discrepancies. I need you to explain a few things." Enrique smiled, the charm he'd always carried with him evident in the curve of his lips. "Of course, Katie. You know I'm always available to help." She slid the stack of documents in front of him, each page a damning piece of evidence that she had spent days compiling. He didn't flinch as he glanced over them, his fingers moving slowly as he examined the information, his eyes scanning the text with the casual detachment of someone who had done this 100 times before. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Enrique looked up. "I'm not sure what you're getting at," he said, his tone light, almost mocking. "I see no reason to worry. Your father's business is in good shape, and as always, I've been doing everything in my power to make sure the books stay clean." Katie took a deep breath. This was it, the moment where everything could go wrong. "Then why are there payments to Cordero Enterprises, Enrique?" she asked, her voice as calm as she could make it. "Why are there meetings that I know nothing about? Why did you hide this from me?" Enrique's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. But it was enough. Katie could see it, the shift in his posture, the tension that wasn't there before. "You're making a mistake, Katie," he said, his voice lowering, becoming more forceful. "There's nothing to concern yourself with. You don't understand the intricacies of the business, of the deals we've made. What happens behind closed doors is not your concern. Your father trusted me to handle things, and I've always done so." The arrogance in his voice, the condescension, made Katie's blood boil. "I am concerned," she said through clenched teeth. "This is my family's future, Enrique. You've been selling us out to the Corderos. Don't try to deny it." For a moment, there was silence. Enrique's eyes darkened, and a thin vein of fear ran across his otherwise composed face. But it was fleeting, quickly masked by a mask of calm. "You have no idea what you're up against, Katie," he said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You think you can fix this, but you're just a pawn. You're tied to Tony Moretti now, and you'll never escape it. No matter what you think you've uncovered, it's too late. The game is over." Katie felt the weight of his words like a stone sinking in her chest. But she couldn't back down now, not when the truth was staring her in the face. "You've been playing both sides," she said, her voice unwavering. "And now, it's time to face the consequences." The room seemed to close in on her as she stared down at Enrique, her fists clenched tightly at her sides. The air felt thick with tension, the stakes higher than she could have imagined. Katie's mind raced. She had two choices: expose Enrique, risk the wrath of the Morettis, and possibly destroy what was left of her family's fragile connection to them, or keep quiet, allowing the betrayal to continue and allowing the Corderos to grow stronger. But in that moment, she knew what had to be done. There was no going back. Katie couldn't allow her father's legacy to be destroyed any further, not by Enrique, and certainly not by the Corderos. "Get out," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "You're done here." Enrique didn't fight back. He didn't need to. His expression told her everything. He had already made his exit, and with it, her family's future was now in her hands. And so, Katie stepped into the next chapter of her life, no longer a pawn, but a player in the high-stakes game that would determine her fate. Katie's hands shook as she sat in front of her laptop, sifting through the records that had become her obsession. The further she dug into her family's financial ruin, the clearer it became. This was no simple case of bad business decisions. The Morettis weren't the only ones responsible for her family's downfall. The Cordero family, the long-standing rivals of the Morettis, had been pulling strings from the shadows. She had suspected it for weeks, but now the evidence was irrefutable. The Corderos had been orchestrating everything from the beginning. Gabriel's abandonment at the altar was the first clear sign, an attempt to humiliate her and destabilize the Vargas family. But it didn't end there. The deeper Katie dug, the more she uncovered: secret meetings, coded messages, and business deals made with the sole intent to break her family and take control of the empire Diego Vargas had built. Her father had been fighting a losing battle for years, and she hadn't even known it. The Corderos, with their superior resources and calculated manipulations, had been systematically weakening the Vargas family's foundation. And now, it all made sense. The public humiliation at her wedding was just the beginning of a much bigger plan. The Corderos didn't want just her family's business. They wanted everything. Her heart raced as she stared at the screen in disbelief. The Corderos had not only played Gabriel like a pawn, they had planned for him to sabotage her marriage, and in turn, her family's future. But Katie realized something even darker. Gabriel's betrayal had been far from an impulsive act. It had been a calculated move, a trap laid by the Corderos to break her. The weight of the conspiracy hit her like a brick. Everything, the deals, the relationships, even the lies, had been part of a much grander scheme. The Corderos weren't just trying to control the Vargas legacy. They were trying to erase it completely. Katie's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. She turned to see Tony Moretti standing in the doorway, his dark eyes unreadable as usual. He had been a fixture in her life since the wedding, and though his presence had once terrified her, she was beginning to see him in a different light. He wasn't just the Mafia boss who had taken over her life. He was a strategic thinker, a man who operated in the shadows but always seemed 2 steps ahead of everyone else. She had started to understand the dangerous world she had been thrust into. It wasn't just about survival, it was about leverage, alliances, and power. And right now, she needed to outsmart the Corderos. "Tony," she said, closing the laptop and standing up to face him. "We need to talk." Tony raised an eyebrow but didn't step into the room. "About what?" "The Corderos," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "They've been playing us. Gabriel's betrayal wasn't just about him. They set it up, the humiliation, the breakdown of our family's reputation. They've been planning this for years, Tony." He studied her for a moment, his gaze sharp as if trying to measure the truth in her words. Finally, he stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "So you figured it out," he said, his voice low. "I didn't have a choice," Katie replied. "I dug through the records. I found the evidence. They've been feeding information to the Corderos for months. They've been working to tear us apart." Tony's jaw tightened, and he walked over to the desk, running a hand over his face. "I knew there was something off about the situation, but I didn't expect this. The Corderos are smart. They've been circling like vultures, waiting for the right moment." "So what do we do?" Katie asked. "If we don't stop them, they'll take everything. Our family, our name, everything my father worked for." Tony turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "We fight back, but we don't do it recklessly. The Corderos are dangerous, Katie. If we go in guns blazing, we risk everything. What you're proposing, it's going to take more than just brute force. It's going to take strategy. And it's going to take trust. Trust? Katie asked, confused. What are you talking about? Us, Tony said simply. You're not alone in this anymore. If you want to protect what's left of your family's empire, you have to trust me. Trust that I can help you. But you have to be smart about it. The Corderos won't back down. If we go in half-cocked, we'll lose everything. If you're in, I need to know you're all in. Katie felt a chill run down her spine. There was no turning back. The Morettis had already taken her in, bound her by marriage, and thrust her into this world of power and danger. But in that moment, she realized something. Her survival depended not just on Tony, but on how well she could navigate the dangerous alliances and enemies that surrounded her. She needed Tony Moretti's trust, and he needed hers. I'm in, she said, her voice firm, unwavering. But we have to move quickly. The Corderos are already making their move. We need to outsmart them before they do even more damage. Tony nodded, the corners of his mouth twitching slightly as though he approved of her resolve. Good. Let's make sure we're ready when they come. Over the next few days, Katie immersed herself in the world of the Morettis. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about thriving in the chaos, using her newfound position to build a strategy that would allow her to protect her family's business. Tony had started to trust her more, giving her small tasks to complete, which she handled with precision. She could see the subtle shifts in his demeanor when she made the right decisions. His approval, a silent acknowledgement that she was beginning to prove herself. Her first real test came when Tony asked her to sit in on a meeting with a group of his lieutenants, all seasoned men with years of experience in the criminal underworld. The tension in the room was palpable as they discussed the current state of affairs with the Corderos. Katie sat quietly, observing, taking in every word and nuance. It wasn't just about what they said, it was about how they said it, the way Tony moved the conversation, the subtle power plays that shifted the dynamics in the room. At one point, one of Tony's men suggested an aggressive move against the Corderos, an all-out attack on their assets. Tony turned to Katie, his eyes locking with hers. "What do you think?" he asked. Katie had expected the question to throw her off, but instead, it felt natural. She had been listening carefully, weighing the pros and cons. "I think an all-out attack will cost us more than it's worth," she said, her voice calm but firm. "The Corderos are waiting for us to make a mistake. If we hit them head-on, we give them the excuse to retaliate. We need to hit them where it hurts, without them seeing it coming." Tony's eyes flickered with approval. "What do you suggest?" "We leverage our position with the Morettis," Katie said. "We take control of their distribution routes, hit them economically without drawing too much attention, force them into a corner and make them come to us." Tony sat back in his chair, a slight smile playing on his lips. The room was silent for a moment before he spoke. "I like it. Smart thinking, Katie. Very smart." Her heart raced with a mixture of relief and excitement. This was the world she had to master now, the world of power, strategy, and survival. And for the first time since her wedding day, she felt like she was finally taking control. That night, as she left the meeting, Tony walked with her down the hallway. "You're doing well, Katie," he said quietly, his tone almost approving. "But don't get too comfortable. The Corderos are ruthless, and they won't back down. This is just the beginning." "I know," Katie replied, her voice steady, "but I'm ready." And for the first time, she truly believed it. In a world that had been turned upside down, Katie was learning how to stand tall, to fight back, and to play the game, not as a victim, but as a player. Katie stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of her jacket, trying to compose herself. Another day, another set of decisions that would determine her future, her family's survival, and her place in this dangerous world she had been thrust into. She had become used to the rhythm of it all: meetings, briefings, strategizing with Tony and his lieutenants, and navigating the complicated web of loyalty, power, and manipulation. But today, something felt different. The edge that had been sharp in the beginning, the clear sense of urgency and survival, had started to dull, replaced by a disorienting mix of emotions she hadn't anticipated. She had always prided herself on her ability to remain detached. After everything that had happened, the public humiliation, her forced marriage to Tony, the discovery of her family's betrayal, it had been easy to bury her feelings beneath a wall of cold practicality. But now, as she ran her fingers through her hair, staring into her own reflection, she realized something had changed. She couldn't deny it anymore. Tony Moretti was no longer just a business partner. He wasn't just the Mafia boss who had married her for convenience, or the ruthless man who ran a criminal empire. He wasn't even just the man who had come into her life like a storm, knocking everything off course. No, Tony had become something more, someone more. As the days passed, Katie began to see the cracks in his armor, those fleeting moments when his cold exterior slipped away, revealing a man who was more than just power and control. There were the brief moments when his smile wasn't forced, when his eyes softened, and he looked at her not as a wife or a business partner, but as someone else. He hadn't said it, not in so many words, but she could feel it. His presence wasn't just about control anymore. There was something else, something deeper, and Katie couldn't ignore it. It wasn't just that Tony had become someone she didn't understand, it was that, in some twisted way, she was beginning to understand him. He was powerful, yes. Commanding, cold. But there was something else buried beneath that exterior, a vulnerability that only surfaced in rare moments when he thought no one was watching. It was in the way his jaw clenched when he talked about his past, in the way his eyes darkened when the Moretti Empire was threatened. And it was in the silence that sometimes stretched between them when he needed space to think, to process. Katie's mind raced. What was she feeling? Attraction? It was the last thing she wanted, the last thing she could afford. But the more time she spent with Tony, the more she saw him as something other than a monster. She was torn between loyalty to her family, her duty to protect them, to keep them afloat, and the confusing emotions stirring in her chest. Was she really beginning to care for him? Was it just the familiarity of their constant proximity, the bond that had started to form out of necessity, or was it something more? The thought made her stomach twist. Could she trust herself, or was she becoming just another pawn in his game? That night, as Katie sat across from Tony in his office, discussing strategy for their next move against the Corderos, she felt the familiar flutter in her chest when their eyes met. It was subtle, but undeniable. Those moments when his gaze lingered a little too long, when he leaned in just a bit closer than was necessary. Katie tried to brush it off, focusing on the task at hand, but it was getting harder. Tony was seated at his massive desk, flipping through reports, his fingers moving with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times. His jawline was sharp in the dim light of his office, his dark hair slightly disheveled from the long day. He didn't look like a mafia boss. He looked like a man who had been through hell and come out on the other side stronger for it. Katie cleared her throat, trying to push away the thoughts that had started to intrude on her mind. "The Corderos won't back down easily," she said, leaning forward, her hands folded on the desk. "They're not going to be satisfied with just the shipping routes. They'll come for the rest of the business next." Tony didn't immediately respond, his eyes still focused on the report in front of him. But after a moment, he met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You're right. They've already started to move, but they don't know what we're capable of yet. They'll soon learn." Katie nodded, trying to ignore the way her heart was beating faster. There was something in his voice, a quiet confidence, the kind that came from years of being at the top. It was intoxicating, even as she knew she shouldn't let herself be affected by it. This wasn't about her feelings, it was about survival. But as Tony leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers, Katie couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to trust him completely. To let herself trust the man who had made her his wife, not out of love, but out of necessity. The silence stretched between them. Neither of them spoke, but the tension in the room was palpable, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. Tony didn't say anything, but his eyes seemed to speak volumes. It was a look that sent a shiver down her spine, intense, almost possessive, as if he were measuring her, trying to decide something. For a moment, Katie felt exposed, vulnerable. The attraction she had been denying was impossible to ignore now. She didn't want to feel this way. She couldn't feel this way. But the more she fought it, the more it seemed to consume her. But before she could process the whirlwind of emotions inside her, her phone buzzed on the desk, the message flashing across the screen. She read it, her heart sinking as she did. The Cordero family has initiated a full-scale attack. They've already moved on the South Port. Katie's stomach dropped. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was war. She looked up at Tony, who was already standing, his expression hardening. The moment of vulnerability between them had passed, replaced by the familiar cold mask of the Mafia boss. He was all business now. "We need to move fast," Tony said, his voice clipped, the calmness of his tone almost eerie. "Gather the men. We'll hit them where it hurts." "I'll handle the Southport logistics," Katie said, standing up quickly. Her voice was steady, but her pulse was racing. This was it. This wasn't just about defending their territory. It was about sending a message to the Corderos that the Morettis wouldn't be cowed. Tony's eyes softened for just a split second, and Katie couldn't help but feel the shift in the air between them. There was a look in his eyes, something almost unreadable. For a brief moment, it seemed as though he was about to say something, but then he was gone, moving quickly to handle the crisis that was unfolding outside their office. Katie followed, her mind racing. The battle lines were being drawn, and she knew that this would change everything. The Corderos had gone too far this time. There was no room for negotiation, no space for peace. This was a fight to the death, and Katie had no choice but to follow Tony's lead. By the time they reached the Southport, the situation had escalated into a full-blown firefight. Katie's heart raced as she ducked behind cover, the sound of gunfire echoing in the night air. The Corderos had made their move, and they weren't going to back down. Tony's men were everywhere, coordinated and ruthless as they fought back against the Cordero soldiers. Katie had never seen anything like this before. This was a world of violence, of power, and of blood. And in the middle of it all was Tony, his eyes sharp, his movements decisive. He was in his element. But for the first time, Katie wasn't just watching as an observer. She was part of it. She was part of his world now, and there was no turning back. In the chaos, Katie spotted a Cordero soldier making a run for it, trying to get away. Without thinking, she took off after him, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't about power anymore. It was about proving herself, showing that she belonged in this world. She caught up to him quickly, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the nearest wall. His eyes widened in surprise, but Katie wasn't interested in his fear. She wanted information. "Who's leading this?" she demanded, her voice low, dangerous. He hesitated for just a moment, then cracked under the pressure. "Enrique Delgado," he whispered. "He's the one pulling the strings." Katie's breath caught in her throat. The traitor. As the last of the Corderos were rounded up and detained, Tony approached, his expression hardening when he saw her standing there, the Cordero soldier at her feet. "Well done," he said, his voice low, his gaze appreciative. "You've earned your place in this world, Katie." In that moment, everything shifted. The attraction, the conflict, everything seemed to fall away. Tony Moretti wasn't just a Mafia boss anymore. He was a man who had become indispensable to her survival. And for the first time, Katie realized just how deep her connection to him went. The war had just begun, and she was ready to fight, by his side. The standoff with the Corderos had escalated faster than Katie had ever anticipated. What had started as small-scale attacks on their operations had quickly turned into an all-out war between the two families. The stakes were higher than ever, and the power struggle for control of the Vargas Empire and the future of the Moretti family was in full swing. Katie had been thrust into the heart of the battle, but she wasn't simply following Tony's lead anymore. She was making moves of her own, positioning herself as a key player in the fight for control. The world she had been thrust into, one of power, violence, and treachery, was one she had learned to navigate quickly. And now, she was ready to strike back. Sitting in the war room at the Moretti estate, Katie leaned over a map of the city, her mind racing. She was no longer just the wife of a mafia boss. She was a strategist, using every piece of information at her disposal to orchestrate their next move. Tony stood beside her, his sharp eyes scanning the map as well, his presence both commanding and comforting in the midst of the chaos. His approval, though rarely spoken, was evident in the way he had started to lean on her for advice, and Katie had earned it. "We need to hit them where it hurts," she said, tapping her finger on the shipping routes. "The Corderos have been using the port to smuggle in goods for their operations. It's their lifeline. If we take that from them, we can cripple their ability to fight back." Tony's gaze flickered to her, his face unreadable, but she could see the approval in his eyes. "You're right. The Corderos are vulnerable in that area, but we need to make sure they don't see it coming." Katie nodded, her mind working quickly. The Corderos had always been a powerful force in the city, but their operations had grown too confident, too exposed. She had spent weeks studying their weaknesses, learning the layout of their routes, their schedules, the movements of their men. She knew the ins and outs of her father's business better than anyone, and she was going to use that to her advantage. "We have to move fast," she continued, her voice steady. "We can't give them the chance to react. We need to use their overconfidence against them." Katie's strategy was simple, but ruthless. Attack where the Corderos were weakest and force them into a position where they had no choice but to play into their hands. The Morettis had always relied on their muscle and intimidation to maintain power. But Katie had learned that in this world, brains often mattered more than brawn. Using her knowledge of the shipping routes, she devised a plan to infiltrate their operation. She knew exactly where their shipments were coming in, and she knew how to intercept them without leaving a trace. The Corderos relied on a network of corrupt dock workers and low-level operatives to keep their operations running smoothly. It was the perfect place to strike. She turned to Tony, her eyes locking with his. "We're going to stage an ambush, a coordinated strike on their shipment tonight. We cut off their supply chain and they won't be able to recover." Tony's lips twitched into a slight smile, his approval clear. "You're confident." "I have to be," Katie replied. "The Morettis have the muscle, but we need to hit them in the wallet, make them feel the loss. Once we control the port, the Corderos will have no choice but to negotiate." Tony nodded, his mind working as he processed the plan. "And how do you propose we get their men to trust us?" Katie smiled, a spark of determination in her eyes. "I've already thought about that. I've made a few calls to some of the dock workers who are on the take. We'll plant someone we can trust in the Cordero operation. Once we have the inside information, we'll move in silently." Tony's expression softened for the briefest moment. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Katie." Katie didn't allow herself to feel any pride at the compliment. There was no time for that. The battle was far from over, and her plan was just the beginning. The Moretti family had resources, muscle, money, and connections, but it was Katie's knowledge of the business, the careful study of their enemies' weaknesses, that had given them an edge. She had learned quickly that the real war wasn't fought with guns alone. It was fought with strategy, with subtlety, and with the careful manipulation of everyone around you. In this world, alliances were as fragile as glass, and trust was a currency more valuable than gold. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the city seemed to hold its breath. Katie, Tony, and a small group of trusted Moretti soldiers gathered at the docks, the cold wind biting at their skin. The port was eerily quiet, the hum of the city barely reaching their ears. Katie stood at the edge of the pier, watching the moonlight glint off the water as she adjusted the collar of her jacket. "It's time," she said, her voice low, her nerves steeled with determination. Tony nodded, his face a mask of focus. He trusted her now. They were in this together, for better or worse. The plan was set into motion. Moretti men infiltrated the perimeter, silently moving into place, while Katie's trusted informant, one of the dock workers who had been feeding them information for weeks, made sure that the Cordero's shipment was on track to arrive at the exact time they had planned. As the Cordero shipment neared, Katie's heart beat in her chest like a drum. This was it, the moment of truth. The Corderos would never see it coming. The first explosion rang out, a sharp crack that shattered the stillness of the night. The dock workers, most of them corrupted by years of dealing with the Corderos, turned on their former allies without hesitation. The Moretti soldiers swarmed the area, taking out the Cordero men in quick, efficient strikes. Katie's pulse quickened as she watched the chaos unfold before her eyes. They moved swiftly, efficiently, nothing wasted, nothing left to chance. The ambush was a success. They had struck at the heart of the Cordero's supply chain, cutting off their primary source of income and sending a clear message. The Morettis were not to be underestimated. But as the smoke cleared and the Cordero men were rounded up, Katie couldn't help but feel a rush of satisfaction. This was the beginning of the end for the Corderos. Their empire, built on deception and violence, was about to collapse. They had underestimated the Morettis, and now they were paying the price. By the time Katie and Tony left the docks, the damage was done. The Cordero's operations had been severely crippled, their shipments intercepted and destroyed. Katie felt the weight of the victory settle over her, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. The next few days were a blur of meetings, planning, and damage control. The Corderos were reeling from the loss, and Katie knew that they wouldn't just take it lying down. The war was far from over. But for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of control. She had done it. She had struck back, and it had worked. Tony's respect for her grew with every passing day, and though their relationship remained professional, she felt the shift between them. They were no longer just partners in a business transaction. They were allies, united by a common goal. And Katie was beginning to see that, in this world, Tony wasn't just a powerful mafia boss. He was a man who understood what it meant to fight for everything you had, and to protect those who mattered most. As the war between the Morettis and the Corderos raged on, Katie knew one thing for sure. The fight for control was just beginning. The night was thick with tension as Katie and Tony stood on the precipice of what would be the final showdown with the Corderos. The city's skyline glowed in the distance, the moonlight barely filtering through the haze of smoke from a dozen fires already burning across the docks. The clash between the Morettis and Corderos had reached its peak, and there was no turning back now. Katie stood beside Tony, her mind clear despite the chaos unfolding around them. This was it, the moment they had been working toward, the end of the Cordero family's stranglehold on the city. She knew the stakes, and she understood the consequences. The Morettis had come for everything, and tonight, they would take it. The plan had been months in the making. It wasn't just about brute force anymore. No, the Morettis were well beyond that. This was about strategy, precision, and timing. They had set the stage, and now they were moving in for the kill. Katie felt the weight of the decision settle in her chest. Tonight, the Corderos would either surrender or fall. There was no middle ground. Tony's voice was low and commanding as he spoke, rallying his men. Tonight, we end this. We move fast, hit them hard, and make sure they understand exactly who controls this city. If we let them get away, they'll only come back stronger. Katie nodded, her mind racing with the intricacies of their plan. They had already cut off the Corderos' main supply lines, attacked their hidden warehouses, and crippled their smuggling operations. Now, the final piece remained: the Corderos' leadership. Without them, their empire would crumble. Tony turned to her, his eyes meeting hers with a mix of determination and something more. Respect, maybe, or even something deeper. "We do this together. No mistakes." Katie met his gaze, her resolve hardening. There was no room for mistakes. They had already come too far. The Morettis had positioned themselves around the Cordero stronghold, an abandoned warehouse just on the edge of the city's industrial district. Katie and Tony had planned everything down to the smallest detail. Every movement, every strike, every countermeasure was already set in motion. As they moved closer to the warehouse, Katie's heart beat steadily in her chest. She wasn't nervous, she was focused. This was her moment, not just as Tony's wife, not just as a pawn in his world, but as a leader in her own right. Her involvement had gone beyond merely surviving in this dangerous world. She had proven herself time and time again, earning Tony's trust, and now she was prepared to prove her worth to everyone else. "Get in, hit them hard, and don't leave anything standing." Tony's voice came through her earpiece, the crackling signal adding to the intensity of the moment. The first wave of Moretti soldiers surged forward, taking out the Cordero sentries stationed outside the warehouse with swift precision. Katie's pulse quickened as the sound of gunfire erupted in the night air. She could feel the adrenaline surge in her veins, her body moving on instinct as she followed Tony's men into the heart of the battle. They stormed the warehouse, guns raised, eyes scanning for the enemy. The Corderos were caught off guard, their men scrambling to defend their turf, but it was too late. The Morettis had already made their move. Katie moved quickly, her mind calculating every move, every risk. She had learned from Tony how to read a situation, how to think several steps ahead. As the chaos unfolded around her, she spotted a Cordero lieutenant attempting to escape through a back exit. Without hesitation, she signaled to one of Tony's men, who took out the lieutenant with a single shot. "Keep moving!" Tony's voice was a sharp command in her ear. "We're taking this place down now!" The Morettis pushed forward, forcing the Corderos into a tight corner. Katie moved with them, her eyes darting over the battlefield as she coordinated the strike. But as the smoke from the gunfire began to clear, Katie spotted something that sent a chill through her body. Enrique Delgado, her father's trusted business partner, the traitor, was standing near the back of the warehouse, speaking to the leader of the Cordero family. For a split second, everything stopped. The sight of Enrique, her father's right-hand man, the one who had sold them out, standing with the enemy, was a blow to Katie's gut. She had known it was him who had been working with the Corderos, but seeing him now so calmly orchestrating the downfall of her family felt like a betrayal of everything she had ever known. She couldn't think about it. Not now. Not while the battle was raging. "Focus!" Tony's voice broke through her thoughts, his words a stark reminder that this wasn't about personal vendettas, it was about survival. But Katie couldn't ignore it. She had to confront Enrique. He was the key to this entire mess, the one who had paved the way for the Corderos to infiltrate her family's business. If they didn't deal with him now, the Corderos would rise again, stronger than ever. With a sharp breath, Katie turned and started making her way toward Enrique. Her heart pounded in her chest, and every instinct screamed at her to stay focused on the fight, but she couldn't. She had to end this. She moved quickly, taking cover behind a stack of crates as she neared him. Enrique was standing next to the Cordero leader, but it wasn't the words they were exchanging that mattered. It was the look on Enrique's face. He didn't look scared. He didn't look regretful. No, he looked like a man who had already accepted his fate, a man who had made his deal and was waiting for the payoff. Katie took a deep breath and stepped out of hiding, her gun raised. "Enrique," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "You should have known better." Enrique turned slowly, his eyes locking with hers. There was no surprise, no fear, just cold indifference. He didn't even flinch as he saw the weapon in her hand. "So, you finally figured it out," he said, his voice almost bored. "I suppose I should be impressed by your persistence, but you're too late." "Too late?" Katie's voice trembled with rage. "You sold out my family. You've been feeding the enemy for months, and now you expect me to just let you walk away?" Enrique smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The Corderos are the future, Katie. Your father was weak. He couldn't see it, but I've always known what's coming. And now, so do you." Katie's finger hovered over the trigger. This was it, the moment where everything could change. But as she stared at Enrique, something in her twisted. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about protecting the future of everything she had known, and for that, there could be no mercy. Without another word, Katie pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot was deafening, but it was only the beginning. The Corderos, now leaderless and disoriented, fell into disarray. The battle raged on, but as Katie took down the traitor, the power balance shifted in an instant. The Corderos no longer had leadership, no clear direction. Their empire crumbled right before their eyes. Tony's men moved swiftly, rounding up the remaining Corderos and eliminating any remaining threats. Katie's heart still pounded in her chest, but she felt a sense of finality wash over her. They had done it. The Corderos were finished. As the smoke cleared, Tony approached her, his face still hard, his eyes scanning the battlefield. But when his gaze landed on her, there was something different in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. "You did well," he said quietly, his voice full of approval. Katie didn't respond immediately. Her mind was still reeling, her body trembling with the aftermath of everything that had happened. This victory had come at a cost, one she wasn't sure she was ready to face. The world she now inhabited was one of constant danger, shifting loyalties and delicate alliances. The Morettis had won this round, but the game was far from over. And Katie knew deep down that in this world, nothing stayed static for long. Tony's hand found hers, a silent acknowledgement of their shared victory, but also a quiet understanding of the cost. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Tony asked softly, his voice steady but full of weight. Katie looked at him, her heart heavy with the realization that the battle for control was never truly over. "I'm ready," she said, her voice firm. And so, together they stood, united in a world that would demand everything from them. The battle with the Corderos had ended in victory. The Morettis had emerged victorious, but the cost had been high, and Katie was no longer the same woman who had walked into this world months ago. She had started as a pawn, forced into a world of ruthless power and danger by her father's debts. But now, as she stood in the aftermath of that battle, she realized that she was no longer just a spectator. She had become a key player, a force to be reckoned with. The aftermath of the Cordero War was a blur. In the days that followed, the Moretti family had consolidated their power, their enemies either wiped out or forced to submit. The once strong Cordero family was now nothing more than a shadow, and the control they had held over the city's criminal empire had crumbled into dust. Katie had proven herself in ways she had never imagined. She had orchestrated the final blow against the Corderos, using her intelligence and her knowledge of the business to strike where it hurt most. Her ability to outthink her enemies, to stay one step ahead of them, had earned her the respect of not just the Morettis, but everyone who operated within their world. Her relationship with Tony had evolved as well. What had started as a marriage of convenience, a business transaction to repay her father's debts, had grown into something far more complicated. Tony had always been the powerful Mafia boss, the man who controlled everything around him. But now, Katie was no longer just the wife at his side. She was his equal, his partner, someone he trusted to make decisions, to lead alongside him. The transformation was clear. Katie stood taller now, not just in stature, but in strength. The fear she had once felt walking into the Moretti world had faded, replaced by a quiet confidence. She had learned how to navigate this world, how to fight for what she wanted, and how to hold her own among the men who had once seen her as nothing more than a pawn. As she walked through the Moretti estate, now officially under their control, the weight of what she had accomplished settled in her chest. She had built something. They had built something, together. The legacy of the Vargas family was now entwined with the Morettis, but it was no longer just Tony's empire. It was theirs. The halls of the estate felt different now. They had been bathed in victory, but also in the reality of what it took to get there. She had shed the remnants of the scared girl who had been abandoned at the altar and become a leader, a queen in her own right. She stepped into Tony's office, where he was standing by the window, looking out over the city. The view was expansive, the skyline a perfect representation of their power. The city that had once been split between the Corderos and the Morettis was now under their control. And it was only the beginning. Tony turned as he heard her footsteps, his eyes locking with hers. For a moment, the world around them seemed to quiet. There was no business to attend to, no strategic decisions to be made. Just the two of them, standing there, aware of what they had accomplished and what was still to come. "You did well," Tony said quietly, the words simple but carrying a weight that only Katie understood. She nodded, her eyes meeting his with a depth of understanding. "We did well." Tony smiled, the expression softening his usually stern face. He walked toward her, his steps confident but purposeful, as though he had made a decision. He stopped in front of her, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. "You're not just my wife anymore, Katie," Tony said, his voice low, serious. "You're part of this empire. You've earned it. You've earned the respect of everyone here. You're not just a piece in this game. You're one of the players." The words hit her harder than she expected. The weight of his statement, the recognition in his voice, made her chest tighten. She wasn't just someone who had been swept into the chaos anymore. She was an equal, and for the first time she felt that truth deep within her. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm not the same person I was when I first walked in here, but I'm ready for whatever comes next." Tony's gaze softened, a rare vulnerability flickering in his eyes. "So am I." In the days that followed, the Moretti Empire grew stronger. The Corderos' fall had been swift, but the real work had only just begun. Katie and Tony worked together, their partnership solidified as they set their sights on further expansion, both inside and outside of the city. They had made enemies, but they had also made allies. The criminal underworld was never static, and the Morettis knew that they would have to keep moving forward, adapting, evolving to stay on top. But through it all, one thing remained constant: Tony and Katie, side by side. There was no longer a question of who held the power. They were partners in every sense of the word, no longer just business associates, but a true team. Their relationship, once born of necessity, had become something far more complex: respect, loyalty, even, in a strange way, trust. Their power was undeniable, and together, they were unstoppable. Tony's men had begun to see Katie differently too. The Morettis had always respected power, and Katie had proven she had plenty of it. She was no longer just the wife who had been thrust into this world. She was a leader, a strategist, someone whose decisions were just as respected as Tony's. Slowly, she had earned her place in a world where women had no business, where power was a commodity traded among men. And in the process, she had proven that she was far more than just a wife. "Everything is falling into place," Tony said one evening, as they stood together in the balcony of the Moretti estate, overlooking the city below. The skyline stretched far into the horizon, the lights twinkling like 1,000 stars. It felt like the world was theirs, like nothing could stand in their way. Katie stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on the railing, the cool night air brushing against her skin. She glanced at him, her thoughts swirling. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" she said, her voice soft. Tony looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment, before a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "We have, but it's just the beginning." Katie turned her gaze back to the city, feeling the weight of his words. They had done it. Together, they had taken everything: the power, the respect, the empire. But the battle for control in the Mafia world was always ongoing. There would always be threats, challenges, and betrayals to face. But for the first time, Katie wasn't afraid. She had proven her worth, earned her place beside Tony as a force to be reckoned with. And whatever came next, she would face it as an equal, a partner, a queen. Tony's hand found hers, and together they stood in silence, looking out over the empire they had built. The future stretched before them, uncertain but filled with possibilities. And for the first time, Katie felt ready to face it all, by his side. They were no longer just a power couple in the Mafia world. They were the Empire's new king and queen, united in strength, in purpose, and in the brutal, unyielding world they had created. Thanks for sticking with me till the end. If this story grabbed you, the next one will blow your mind. It's wilder, crazier, and full of twists you won't see coming. Don't miss it. Just click the video popping up on your screen right now and jump straight in.